The Madman's Diary. Good evening. Settle in. Dim the lights, if you dare. Pour yourself something strong. You might need it. Tonight, we pry open a story that began, as so many unsettling tales do, not with a scream, but with the quiet thud of unexpected post arriving on a dreary Tuesday morning. We find ourselves within the venerable, though undeniably crumbling, walls of Ashworth Asylum. Perched precariously on the outskirts of Boston, a place where sanity is a commodity often in short supply, and secrets fester like mold in the damp stone corridors. Our guide through this particular labyrinth of the mind is Dr. Eris Thorne. Picture him, late 40s, perhaps early 50s, though the perpetual weariness etched around his eyes might suggest older. Graying temples frame a face that was once handsome, now more drawn. Honed sharp by years spent navigating the fractured landscapes of other people's realities. He possesses a keen intellect, a reputation for meticulousness bordering on the obsessive, and a professional skepticism as deeply ingrained as the scent of antiseptic that clings to his tweed jacket. Thorne is, by all accounts, a good psychiatrist, perhaps even a great one. But the weight of Ashworth, the endless parade of shattered minds, and the bureaucratic indifference that grinds away at even the most dedicated, has taken its toll. He's tired, the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that sleep rarely touches. He sits in his office, a room that strives for professional comfort, but achieves only a sort of faded dignity. Leather armchair cracked in places, mahogany desk scarred by countless files and spilled coffees, shelves overflowing with textbooks whose theories often feel woefully inadequate against the raw, visceral chaos he confronts daily. Outside, the relentless New England rain drums against the tall, barred window, blurring the already bleak view of the asylum grounds. It's a sound that usually lulls, but today it feels like a premonition, a tapping insistence. The package arrived with the morning mail, unremarkable amidst the bills and interdepartmental memos. Brown paper, tied with twine, addressed simply to Dr. A. Thorne, Ashworth Asylum. No return address. Curiosity, a rare flicker in his jaded routine, prompts him to set aside the latest patient file. Inside the wrapping, nestled amongst yellowed packing straw that smells faintly of dust and something else, something indefinably old, lies a small, heavy wooden box, unadorned, dark with age, and resting atop it, a single, folded letter penned in an elegant, spidery hand he vaguely recognizes. He unfolds the letter. It's from the executor of the estate of a former colleague, Dr. Alastair Finch, a man Thorne hadn't seen in years, known more for his eccentric historical research than his brief, unremarkable stint at Ashworth a decade prior. Finch, the letter informs him with dry legal brevity, has passed away. The box, according to Finch's explicit instructions, was to be delivered to Thorne upon his death. No explanation, no context, just a final, cryptic request from a man Thorne barely remembered. Alastair Finch. The name dredges up hazy memories, an older man, prone to rambling lectures on obscure folklore and local legends, often seen scribbling in notebooks during staff meetings. Thorne recalls dismissing him as harmlessly eccentric, lost in his own arcane world. Why would Finch leave him anything? He lifts the lid of the wooden box. Inside, cushioned by more of that oddly scented straw, lies a single object, a book. Or rather, what was a book? It's a journal, bound in dark, heavily worn leather, the cover scuffed and stained, the corners softened with time and handling. It feels strangely dense in his hands, heavier than its size would suggest. There's no title embossed on the spine or cover, only the faint impression where one might have been. The pages, thick and yellowed, are unevenly cut, some sticking out slightly farther than others. A faint, musty odor rises from it, stronger than the straw. The smell of old paper, yes, but mingled with something else, something dry and faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. A name is scrawled on the inside cover, written in a cramped, agitated hand that looks nothing like Finch's elegant script. Walter Gilman. The name hits Thorne with the force of an unexpected diagnosis. Walter Gilman, not Finch's patient, but Thorne's. Or rather, he had been, briefly, years ago. Gilman was one of those cases that linger, a footnote of professional unease. Admitted under murky circumstances, diagnosed with a complex schizoaffective disorder with paranoid delusions. He wasn't at Ashworth long. His stay was marked by intense, rambling monologues about impossible geometries, unseen entities lurking in angles, and a pervasive, suffocating sense of being watched by something vast and uncaring. Standard fare for paranoid schizophrenia, Thorne had concluded at the time, albeit presented with unusual intensity. Gilman had been transferred abruptly, records sealed, destination unknown, or perhaps, Thorne now dimly recalled a rumor, he had simply vanished from a locked transfer vehicle. Another administrative loose end in the asylum's frayed tapestry. And now, years later, Gilman's journal sits in Thorne's hands, delivered via the ghost of a forgotten colleague. Why? How did Finch even come to possess it? He runs a thumb over the brittle cover. There's a strange texture beneath the wear, almost like scales, very fine, pressed into the leather. He dismisses the thought as fanciful, a product of the room's gloom and his own fatigue. He opens the journal carefully, the spine groaning in protest. The first few pages contain dates. Erratic entries, sketches, not random doodles, but precise, unsettling diagrams of interlocking lines and impossible angles, reminiscent of Escher, but infused with a palpable sense of menace. The handwriting starts relatively clear, documenting mundane observations, the weather, the quality of the asylum food, complaints about medication. But quickly the script tightens, becoming spikier, more urgent. The ink darkens, pressed hard into the page, as if the writer feared the words might evaporate. And then the narrative shifts. Gilman stops recording the mundane and begins documenting them. The encounters, descriptions of shadows detaching themselves from walls, of whispers that seem to emanate from the very structure of space-time, of glimpses of something moving in the periphery, something vast and ancient and utterly alien. You give it a name, scrawled over and over in the margins, sometimes circled, sometimes furiously crossed out. The shadow unstitched. Thorne feels a prickle of unease, distinct from his usual professional detachment. It's the lucidity that disturbs him, the terrifyingly meticulous detail. Gilman describes the subtle shifts in air pressure, the specific, non-Euclidean geometries glimpsed in reflections, the precise quality of the silence that follows the whispers. It doesn't read like the fragmented ramblings of psychosis. It reads like testimony, like a terrified, meticulous cataloging of the impossible. He turns a page. A drawing dominates it. A chaotic swirl of lines converging on a central point of absolute blackness, surrounded by what looked disturbingly like fragmented eyes. Beneath it, a single sentence, written with unnerving clarity. It sees me, even through the walls, even through my skull. The angles are wrong. They're all wrong. Thorne closes the journal abruptly, the slap of the cover echoing slightly in the quiet room. The rain continues its relentless drumming. He tells himself it's just a case study, a fascinating, albeit disturbing, look into a profoundly diseased mind. A relic passed on by an eccentric historian. Nothing more. But as he places the journal back in its box, his fingers brush against the worn leather cover again. And this time, the feeling is undeniable. It's not scales. It's something else. Something that feels disturbingly like dried skin. Not animal hide. Something else. A chill, unrelated to the damp air seeping through the window frame, snakes down Eris Thorne's spine. The journal sits in its box on his desk, inert, silent. Yet somehow, it feels like the most potent presence in the room. A dark seed planted in the sterile soil of his skepticism. He glances towards the corners of his office, where the afternoon shadows are beginning to gather, deepening into shapes that seem, just for a fleeting moment, less than entirely random. He shakes his head, rubs his tired eyes. It's the power of suggestion, the grim atmosphere of Ashworth, the unsettling nature of the diary's contents. It has to be, doesn't it? Chapter 1. The Tattered Inheritance. The weight of Ashworth Asylum settled not just on the shoulders, but deep within the bones. Dr. Eris Thorne felt it most acutely in the late afternoons, when the low, gray Boston sky seemed to press down on the slate roof, leaching color from the world outside his barred window. The building itself, a sprawling Victorian monolith of red brick darkened by a century of grime and sorrow, seemed to sigh around him, a constant susurrus of shuffling feet, distant, muffled cries, and the relentless ticking of unseen clocks measuring out lifetimes of institutional confinement. Today, the weight felt heavier, compounded by the presence of the small, dark wooden box sitting squarely in the center of his otherwise meticulously organized desk. Inside it, Walter Gilman's journal pulsed with a latent energy that prickled at the edges of Thorne's awareness, a silent dissonance in the grim harmony of the asylum. He hadn't touched it since closing it hours ago, the disturbing sensation of that not-quite-leather cover still vivid beneath his fingertips. He'd tried to immerse himself in patient files, in clinical notes demanding diagnoses and treatment plans, the familiar, quantifiable language of his profession. But his gaze kept drifting back to the box. Walter Gilman. The name echoed with a faint, unsettling resonance. A case file incomplete, a narrative abruptly severed. Schizoaffective disorder, paranoid delusions. Elaborate descriptions of impossible realities. Textbook. Almost. Yet Thorne recalled a disquieting intensity in Gilman's eyes, a conviction that transcended mere delusion. And then, the sudden transfer, the sealed records. Loose ends were common at Ashworth, swallowed by bureaucracy or budget cuts. But Gilman's departure had felt different, more like an erasure. A sharp rap on his door jolted him. Eris? Got a minute? Dr. Lena Hansen stood in the doorway, radiating an energy that always seemed slightly incongruous within Ashworth's lethargic walls. Younger than Thorne by a decade, sharp, pragmatic, with a no-nonsense air and eyes that missed little, Hansen was one of the few colleagues Thorne genuinely respected. Even if her unwavering adherence to biological psychiatry sometimes grated against his more nuanced, albeit weary, approach. She stepped inside, carrying a tablet, her expression a mixture of professional concern and mild exasperation. Just reviewing the dosage adjustments for Miller in Ward C, she said, her voice brisk. His auditory hallucinations are spiking again. Thought I'd run it by you before signing off. You look like you've seen a ghost. Thorne managed a faint smile, gesturing vaguely towards the box. Just dealing with one, perhaps. Remember Walter Gilman? Hansen frowned, tapping her chin thoughtfully. Gilman. Rings a bell. Admitted maybe 5-6 years ago. Intense guy. Delusions about geometry and angles, wasn't it? Didn't stay long. Transferred out to that state facility upstate, the one with the forensic unit. That was the official story, Thorne said, picking up a pen, rolling it between his fingers. Unofficially, he hesitated. Voicing the half-remembered rumors felt unprofessional, speculative. Let's just say his departure was abrupt. His effects somehow ended up with old Dr. Finch, and Finch's estate just sent them to me. He nodded towards the box again. Mostly junk, it seems, except for this. He didn't elaborate further, not yet wanting to articulate the nature of the journal or the strange effect it was having on him. Hansen raised an eyebrow, her skepticism palpable. Alastair Finch, the folklore fanatic? God, I remember him. Cornered me once by the water cooler for 40 minutes talking about ley lines and pre-colonial burial grounds influencing patient psychoses. Interesting theory, zero evidence. Why would he have Gilman's things, and why send them to you? Exactly, Thorne murmured. Questions I don't have answers to. Well, Hansen shrugged, clearly deeming the mystery less pressing than Miller's escalating psychosis. Don't let ancient history distract you too much. We've got enough current madness to contend with. She tapped her tablet. About Miller's haloperidol. They discussed the patient for 10 minutes, falling back into the familiar rhythm of clinical assessment and pharmaceutical strategy. It was grounding, reassuringly concrete. Yet, even as he focused on dosages and side effects, Thorne felt the pull of the journal on his desk, an unseen gravity. Hansen, sharp as ever, seemed to notice his distraction as their conversation wound down. "Seriously, Eris," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You look drained. More than usual. Everything all right?" "Fine, Lena. Just Ashworth." He offered a tired shrug, a universally understood explanation within these walls. "Yeah," she conceded, glancing around the oppressive room. "Ashworth." She paused at the door. "If that Gilman stuff turns out to be anything more than Finch's usual occult nonsense, let me know." Pathological curiosity, you understand. A ghost of a smile touched her lips before she disappeared down the echoing corridor. Left alone once more, the silence in the office seemed deeper, charged with unspoken questions. He looked at the box. Pathological curiosity. Hansen had unknowingly hit the mark. His own professional detachment was warring with a more primal, unsettling intrigue. He ran a hand over his face. The fatigue suddenly immense. He should lock the journal away, perhaps send it to the asylum archives, or even discard it. It was, after all, just the disturbed ramblings of a severely ill man, filtered through the eccentricities of a deceased colleague. But he couldn't. The feel of the cover, the impossible diagrams, the chilling lucidity of that single sentence, "It sees me," held him captive. It wasn't just a case file. It felt like a message in a bottle, tossed from the shores of a reality he couldn't comprehend. Later that evening, long after the shuffling footsteps had faded and the night shift had settled into its monotonous rhythm, Thorne found himself unlocking his office. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that seeped through the window frames. The asylum was quieter now, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. He switched on only the small desk lamp, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, leaving the corners submerged in darkness. He poured himself a small measure of scotch from the bottle he kept locked in his bottom drawer. A breach of protocol, perhaps, but one he increasingly allowed himself. The amber liquid offered little warmth against the internal chill the journal had ignited. He lifted the diary from its box, the strange weight of it settling in his hands again. He opened it, more carefully this time, to the first dated entry. September 14th. The year confirmed it was roughly 6 months before Gilman's admission to Ashworth. The handwriting, while cramped, was initially legible, the thoughts coherent, if tinged with anxiety. September 14th. Rain again. The city feels like it's dissolving. Rent is due. Landlord left another note. 3rd this week. Says the noise complaints are piling up. Noise. What noise? It's the silence I can't stand. The way it buzzes sometimes right behind my ears. Try drawing again. The lines won't stay straight. They keep bending. Thorne traced the small, precise sketch in the margin. A simple cube, but the lines seemed to waver, refusing to adhere to proper perspective, hinting at an impossible dimensionality. Standard anxiety, perhaps early signs of thought disorder. He read on, skipping through entries detailing struggles with temp jobs. Descriptions of lonely walks through Boston's older, crooked streets, the North End, Beacon Hill, notes on library books about architecture and mathematics. Mundane struggles, yet threaded through with a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being watched, followed not by people, but by patterns. October 3rd, saw it again today, in the reflection of the State House dome. Not a cloud, not a bird, just a ripple, like the sky had snagged on something sharp. Turned away, looked back. Gone. But I felt it. Cold, like standing too close to dry ice. October 21st. The angles in my room are wrong, especially the corner where the ceiling meets the 2 walls above my bed. It doesn't look right. It's too sharp or not sharp enough. Sometimes, if I stare long enough, it seems to deepen, like it's not a corner at all, but an opening. Thorne paused, swirling the scotch in his glass. This was classic delusional thinking, anthropomorphizing inanimate objects, paranoia manifesting as perceptual distortions. Textbook. Yet, Gilman's descriptions were so specific, so devoid of the usual grandiose or persecutory narratives. He wasn't claiming the CIA was altering his room. He was describing geometry behaving incorrectly. It was bizarrely technical. He turned another page. The handwriting was subtly changing, becoming more slanted, the pressure heavier. November 12th. Woke up last night. Felt static electricity in the air. That buzzing silence again, but louder. Couldn't move. Sleep paralysis. I told myself. Happened before. But then I saw it. In a corner. The wrong corner. It wasn't dark in there. It was absent. Like a hole punched through the world. And there was something looking back. Didn't see eyes. Just presence. Vast. Uncaring. Geometric. Heard a sound. Not a sound exactly. More like a crackling in the structure of things. Then I could move again. Corner looked normal. But the air still smells like ozone. And there's a mark on the wall. A thin scratch, like from a compass point, impossibly precise. Right where the absence was. Thorne leaned closer, peering at the page. The meticulousness was unnerving. Gilman wasn't just rambling. He was documenting, observing, like a naturalist cataloging a terrifying new species. He found himself glancing involuntarily towards the corners of his own dimly lit office. The shadows seemed deeper, less inert than before. He took a longer sip of scotch, the burn sharp in his throat. It was suggestion, nothing more. The power of a vivid narrative. He flipped further into the journal, the pages growing more brittle. The entries more erratic, but also longer, more detailed. Drawings became more frequent, more complex, spirals that seemed to recede into infinity, lattices of impossible complexity, shapes that hurt the eyes to look at directly. And then he found an entry that made him set his glass down, his hands suddenly unsteady. December 7th. It has a name. It whispered it in the space between heartbeats. Not a word, not a sound, but a shape imprinted on my mind. I try to write it, but the letters twist. I try to draw it, but the lines collapse. The closest I can get, the closest human thought can approach its repulsive geometry, is the shadow unstitched. Because it comes from the places where reality frays, where the seams are loose. It pulls at the threads. Last night it touched me. Not physically. Worse. It touched my thoughts. Showed me glimpses of the spaces between seconds. Of the colors that exist outside light. I think a part of me is unraveling. Beneath the entry, Gilman had attempted to draw it again. Not the entity itself, but the concept, the name. It was a frantic, overlapping scrawl of characters that seemed simultaneously alphabetic and symbolic, twisting and turning back on themselves, creating a sigil of pure cognitive dissonance. Looking at it made Thorne's eyes water, a faint headache beginning to pulse behind his temples. He closed the journal, the silence of the asylum pressing in. The scotch hadn't helped. The weariness was still there, but now it was overlaid with a sharper, more alert sense of dread. This was more than a patient's delusion. Or if it was delusion, it was of a kind so profound, so alien, that it threatened to undermine the very foundations of the reality Thorne thought he knew. The tattered inheritance from Walter Gilman felt less like a clinical artifact and more like a contagion, waiting patiently to infect its next host. And Eris Thorne, psychiatrist, skeptic, felt the first, undeniable symptoms taking root in the shadowed corners of his own mind. Chapter 2. Scrawls of the Impossible. Sleep offered little respite for Dr. Eris Thorne in the days following his unsettling nocturnal communion with Walter Gilman's journal. He'd locked the book back in its wooden box, placing the box itself inside a locked filing cabinet drawer usually reserved for confidential patient assessments. Out of sight, perhaps, but certainly not out of mind. The journal's presence lingered, a psychic weight added to the already considerable burden of Ashworth. He found himself distracted during sessions. The carefully constructed narratives of his patients occasionally blurring with Gilman's frantic scrawls about impossible angles and frayed reality. He caught himself glancing too often towards the shadowed corners of rooms, scrutinizing the way light fell, searching for, what? Ripples in the air? Geometric inconsistencies? The absurdity of it chafed against his ingrained rationalism. Yet the unease persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He told himself it was transference, a professional hazard. Immersing oneself in the disturbed thoughts of others could inevitably color one's own perceptions, especially when compounded by fatigue and the oppressive atmosphere of the asylum. He doubled down on his clinical detachment, focusing fiercely on differential diagnoses, medication efficacy, behavioral modification plans. He even took on an extra case review for Dr. Hansen, burying himself in the familiar complexities of routine psychopathology as a form of self-administered therapy. But the journal called to him. In the quiet moments between appointments, during his solitary lunch break, late at night when the asylum settled into its uneasy slumber, the memory of Gilman's tight, urgent script and those disturbing diagrams pulled at his curiosity with an insistence that felt almost gravitational. It was nearly a week later, driven by a sleepless night and a growing sense of intellectual cowardice. Was he afraid to confront the full scope of Gilman's documented experience? That Thorne found himself unlocking the filing cabinet drawer once more. The air in his office felt stale, heavy. He retrieved the wooden box, the dark grain seeming to absorb the weak lamplight. He hesitated, then carried the box and its contents home with him that evening, a transgression against his own unspoken rule of keeping Ashworth and its burdens confined within its walls. His apartment, usually a sterile sanctuary of quiet order, felt different with the journal inside it. Larger, somehow, and emptier, the familiar shadows stretching into unfamiliar shapes. He poured himself a scotch, a habit becoming worryingly regular, and settled into his worn leather armchair, the journal open on his lap. He bypassed the earlier entries, seeking the point where Gilman's narrative had truly begun its terrifying acceleration, where the descriptions moved beyond fleeting glimpses and unsettling feelings into sustained, detailed encounters. January 9th. It's learning. Or perhaps I'm just becoming more attuned to its frequency. Last night, the geometry wasn't confined to the corners. It was superimposed on everything. The pattern on the wallpaper seemed to crawl, shifting into configurations that defied perspective. My reflection in the window wasn't quite symmetrical, like looking at a poorly folded photograph of myself. And the sound, not the crackling this time, but a low, resonant hum, felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. A frequency just below the threshold of hearing, perhaps, but its pressure was immense. Like the air itself was vibrating. January 17th saw it more clearly. Not in it. A presence defined by absence. Imagine looking at a complex machine, but instead of seeing gears and levers, you only see the empty spaces between them, yet somehow perceive the machine's function through that negative space. It was like that, a shape suggested by the way reality bent around it. It occupied the hallway outside my door. I didn't see it through the peephole. I felt its multidimensional intrusion into the mundane architecture of the building. It left residue, a faint, oily shimmer on the floorboards that vanished when direct light hit it. And that smell again, ozone and something else, something indescribably ancient, like dust from a tomb sealed for millennia. Thorne found himself holding his breath as he read. Gilman's descriptions were becoming increasingly sophisticated, employing metaphors that strained the limits of language. This wasn't the disorganized thought process typical of schizophrenia. It was a desperate attempt to articulate the ineffable, to map an experience that fundamentally broke the rules of perception. He flipped forward, the handwriting growing more erratic, interspersed with diagrams that were less geometric sketches and more like frantic attempts to capture fleeting, impossible forms. February 4th. The unstitched shadow. It showed me things, not visually, not like a film, more like data downloaded directly into my consciousness. concepts incompatible with human neurology. I saw time not as a river, but as a crystalline structure, fractally complex, and perceived points where moments fractured, creating vulnerabilities. It showed me the texture of void. It revealed the ludicrously thin membrane separating what is from the infinite, what should not be. It's amused by us, by our rigid, three-dimensional perception, our linear understanding of causality. We are like flatworms crawling on a tapestry, unaware of the threads beneath, the hands that weave, or the patterns that dictate our paths. Thorne felt a wave of dizziness. Concepts incompatible with human neurology. The phrase resonated with a terrifying clinical precision. Was this the ultimate expression of depersonalization? A mind so fractured it perceived itself receiving alien data streams? Or was Gilman actually touching something? He forced himself to focus. Reading Gilman's attempts to describe the entity's appearance, not a physical form, but a shifting locus of dimensional distortion. February 22nd. It doesn't have a face or limbs or organs. It is a knot in the fabric of space-time. Sometimes it manifests as angles that cut through reality, sharp enough to slice light. Other times, it's a presence that swallows sound and warmth. A patch of absolute cold and silence. Saw a reflection of it today, not in glass, but in the surface tension of water in a cup. A swirling, non-shape of utter blackness, absorbing the light around it. Staring into it felt like staring into the heat death of the universe compressed into a single point. I dropped the cup. The water spilled, the reflection shattered. But the memory of that blackness remains, burned behind my eyelids. Thorne closed his eyes, the image Gilman described alarmingly vivid in his own mind. He recognized the power of suggestion, the way the human brain seeks patterns, fills in blanks. Yet, the consistency of Gilman's descriptions, the internal logic, however alien, was deeply unsettling. He found himself wanting to research non-Euclidean geometry, theoretical physics about higher dimensions, not merely to understand Gilman's delusions, but with a creeping, horrifying suspicion that Gilman might have stumbled upon something real, albeit filtered through a shattering psyche. He got up, pacing the confines of his quiet apartment. The scotch wasn't helping tonight. It merely dulled the edges, leaving the core unease untouched. He walked to the window, looking down at the rain-slicked Boston street below. The familiar cityscape seemed subtly altered, the angles of buildings, the intersection of streets, holding a new, potentially sinister significance. Was that streetlight flickering erratically, or was it just his tired eyes? Did that shadow, pooling in the alleyway across the street, seem unusually deep, unnaturally still? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This was ridiculous. He was a man of science, of observable phenomena and logical deduction. He was letting a dead man's fantasies infect his reason. He needed distance. He needed to treat the journal purely as a clinical document, analyze its linguistic patterns, its thematic progressions, correlate them with known symptoms of psychosis. Returning to his chair, he forced himself to adopt that analytical mindset. He began making notes on a separate pad, jotting down recurring motifs. Geometry, angles, sensory distortion, auditory, visual, tactile. Themes of observation, intrusion, cosmic indifference, the specific phrase unstitched shadow. He noted the progression from vague anxiety to specific, recurring hallucinatory/delusional experiences. He looked for inconsistencies, contradictions, but the core narrative remained disturbingly coherent, its internal rules unwavering. Gilman didn't suddenly claim the entity was communicating telepathically in English or demanding sacrifices. Its alien nature remained consistently, terrifyingly alien. He reached a section dated in early March, shortly before Gilman must have been admitted or apprehended. The writing was cramped, almost illegible, the ink smudged in places as if by trembling hands or tears. March 5th. It's closer now, not just observing. It's influencing. Objects move when I'm not looking. Not large movements, just shifted. A book tilted on the shelf. A pen rolled to the edge of the desk. Small proofs of its presence, designed to fray the nerves. Found scratches inside a locked drawer this morning. 3 parallel lines, perfectly incised into the wood. Like claw marks, but too precise, too geometric. The angles are wrong everywhere now. Nothing aligns. The world feels loose. March 12th. It whispers. Not words. Not anymore. It whispers possibilities. Shows me pathways through the angles, shortcuts through folded space. It offers knowledge. At a price I don't fully understand. But I feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. It wants entry, not just into my mind. Into this plane. It sees this reality as flawed, primitive, ripe for unraveling. Thorn read the last sentence again. Ripe for unraveling. A chill traced its way down his spine, colder and sharper than the draft from the window. He looked at the diagrams accompanying these later entries. They were frantic, almost violent slashes of ink, yet contained within them a terrifying, complex symmetry, hinting at multidimensional forms that seemed to writhe on the page. One drawing in particular caught his eye. It wasn't just lines. It incorporated symbols, some resembling arcane sigils, others looking disturbingly like complex mathematical equations intertwined with organic, impossible shapes. It radiated a sense of profound wrongness. Beneath this complex, disturbing illustration, Gilman had written a single, shaky sentence. It showed me the key, not a physical key, a convergence, a time, a place, a state of mind. Ashworth. Thorne's blood ran cold. Ashworth. Gilman had connected the entity, the source of his terror and his perceived revelations, directly to the asylum. His asylum. Suddenly, the journal wasn't just the record of one man's descent into madness. It felt like a map, a warning, pointing towards a darkness lurking within the very walls where Thorne worked. A darkness that perhaps hadn't departed with Walter Gilman. The scrawls of the impossible no longer felt like the ravings of a lunatic. They felt like field notes from the edge of an abyss that was suddenly, terrifyingly close to home. Chapter 3. Echoes in the examination room. The name Ashworth scrawled in Gilman's frantic hand acted like a tuning fork, striking a dissonant chord that reverberated through Eris Thorne's meticulously ordered world long after he'd reluctantly closed the journal. It transformed the tattered book from a disturbing psychological artifact into something far more sinister. A potential harbinger, a map pointing not to a geographical location, but perhaps to a vulnerability within the very fabric of the institution he inhabited daily. The asylum, already a repository of fractured minds and quiet desperation, now felt overlaid with a new, invisible layer of potential menace. Gilman's unstitched shadow, lurking conceptually within its decaying brick and mortar. Thorne's professional skepticism battled fiercely against the rising tide of unease. He tried to rationalize. Ashworth was likely significant to Gilman simply because it represented the nadir of his descent, the place where his illness became undeniable, where society confined him. It was a symbol of his loss of control, nothing more. Projecting the entity onto the institution was a classic delusional mechanism, merging internal terror with external reality. He repeated these logical assertions to himself like a mantra during his commute, walking the long, echoing corridors, sitting through staff meetings where budget cuts and patient-to-staff ratios were debated with weary resignation. Yet, the mantra felt increasingly hollow. Gilman's descriptions weren't just fearful projections. They were laced with that unnerving specificity, that alien consistency. A convergence. A time, a place, a state of mind. It sounded less like a delusion and more like instructions. He started seeing Ashworth through a subtly altered lens. The familiar oppressive atmosphere now carried a different undertone. Was the chill in certain hallways just poor heating, or was it the lingering absolute cold Gilman described? Were the flickering fluorescent lights in Ward B merely faulty wiring? or echoes of the static and wrong frequencies that heralded the entity's presence. He found himself scrutinizing the architecture, the way walls met ceilings, the angles formed by intersecting corridors, half expecting to see the subtle distortions Gilman chronicled. He saw nothing, of course, nothing beyond peeling paint, water stains, and the inherent gloom of an underfunded century-old institution. But the possibility now existed in his mind, a seed of doubt planted by the journal, germinating in the fertile ground of Ashworth's inherent strangeness. His interactions with patients also felt subtly shifted. He listened more intently to descriptions of perceptual anomalies, paranoia, feelings of being watched or influenced by unseen forces. He'd always categorized these as symptoms, products of neurochemical imbalances or psychological trauma. Now a sliver of doubt, cold and unwelcome, occasionally inserted itself. What if, just what if, some patient weren't merely delusional but were sensitive, attuned, like Gilman, to frequencies beyond the normal spectrum of reality? He pushed the thought away violently whenever it surfaced. It was dangerous, unprofessional, the path towards losing his own objectivity. But it lingered, an echo of Gilman's madness whispering at the edges of his clinical judgment. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing patient files in the records room, a cramped, dimly lit space smelling of dust and decaying paper, tucked away in the asylum's oldest wing, Thorne stumbled upon Gilman's original admission file. It wasn't sealed, merely archived. Perhaps the transfer records were sealed, but the initial intake was accessible. His heart beat a little faster. Here was concrete data, objective clinical observation to counterbalance the subjective horror of the journal. He pulled the thick manila folder, the label stark, Gilman, Walter, admitted April 7th. Discharged/transferred May 19th. A short stay. He opened it, scanning the initial psychiatric evaluation, penned by a resident long since departed. Schizoaffective disorder, paranoid type. Auditory and visual hallucinations noted. Disorganized thought patterns. Prescribed antipsychotics, dosage noted. Standard procedure. But then he found the nursing notes. Daily observations logged with professional brevity. April 10th, patient withdrawn. Refuses medication. Claims it dulls the edges he needs to see properly. Observed staring intently at corners of room for extended periods. April 15th, agitated during the night. Reported geometric incursions and whispers from the walls. Required sedation. April 22nd, found patient attempting to scratch symbols onto the wall with a plastic utensil. Symbols confiscated resemble complex geometric patterns. Patient claims they are wards against angular intrusion. May 1st, patient calmer today. Engaged in conversation, but topic fixated on non-Euclidean space and dimensional vulnerabilities. Highly articulate, but content remains delusional. May 9th, incident in common room. Patient became distressed, claiming another patient's shadow detached and moved incorrectly. Restrained briefly. Later claimed the unstitched shadow was testing the boundaries. Thorne read the entries, a chill creeping up his spine despite the stuffy air of the records room. The nurse's objective observations mirrored Gilman's subjective journal entries with unnerving accuracy. The fixation on geometry, the whispers, the symbols, even the specific name unstitched shadow. It was all there, documented within the clinical context of the asylum years ago. This wasn't just Thorne's interpretation of the journal. Gilman had been living this narrative within Ashworth's walls. He looked closer at the confiscated symbol sketch appended to the May 1st note. It was simpler than the later drawings in the journal. Cruder, scratched onto a napkin presumably, but the core elements were there, the impossible angles, the suggestion of depth where none should exist. It looked disturbingly similar to the complex sigil Gilman had drawn near the end, the one labeled the key. Then he found the final entry before the transfer notification. A brief, almost cryptic note from the attending physician at the time, Dr. Matthews, a man Thorne remembered as stern and by the book. May 18th, significant overnight event. Patient found in catatonic state. Unresponsive. Unusual environmental readings reported by night staff. Unexplained drop in ambient temperature in patient's room. Reports of static discharge. Physical exam unremarkable beyond catatonia. Consultation with Dr. Finch regarding historical precedents of localized phenomena. Decision made for immediate transfer to specialized facility for further observation. Dr. Finch, Alastair Finch, the eccentric historian, had been consulted. Why? What historical precedents could possibly relate to a patient's catatonia and alleged static discharge? And why the immediate, almost panicked, transfer? The official record felt incomplete. Sanitized. It hinted at something more significant, something unsettling enough to warrant bypassing standard protocols and involving an outsider like Finch. Thorne closed the file slowly. The musty smell of old paper suddenly seeming cloying, suffocating. The journal wasn't just Gilman's story. It was intertwined with Ashworth's own hidden history, involving personnel Thorne himself knew or knew of. The lines were blurring, the past reaching out to touch the present. He returned the file to its place on the shelf, but the information resonated within him. He left the records room, stepping back into the main corridor. The asylum seemed different again, charged with a history deeper and stranger than he had ever suspected. As he walked back towards his office, passing one of the older, less used examination rooms, he thought he heard something. A faint sound, almost subliminal, like the whisper of static or the dragging of a sharp point across plaster. He paused, listening intently. Silence. Just the usual hum of the building. The distant clatter of a food trolley. He shook his head. Auditory pareidolia. His mind, primed by the journal and the files, was manufacturing stimuli. Yet, as he turned to continue walking, his gaze snagged on the wall, just inside the examination room doorway, visible through the small wire mesh window. There, low down near the baseboard, almost hidden in the dim light, were three faint, parallel lines scratched into the ancient plaster. They were fine, precise, almost surgical in their execution, like claw marks, but too precise, too geometric, exactly as Walter Gilman had described finding in his own locked drawer, just before the whispers began offering him the key. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. Coincidence? Vandalism by a patient? Or was it an echo? An imprint left behind, resonating across time, triggered perhaps by his own focused attention on Gilman's story? The rational explanation warred with the cold dread coiling in his stomach. He backed away from the door slowly, his professional detachment shattering like fragile glass. The echoes of the madman's diary were no longer confined to the pages of the book or the recesses of Thorne's mind. They were beginning to manifest within the very walls of Ashworth Asylum. The discovery of the scratches, those three precise, parallel lines marring the plaster near the baseboard of the disused examination room, lodged itself in Eris Thorne's mind like a shard of ice. He couldn't shake the image, nor the chilling resonance with Gilman's journal entry. Coincidence felt like an increasingly flimsy shield against the mounting evidence of something deeply strange. He forced himself to maintain composure, retreating to the relative sanctuary of his office, but the asylum's atmosphere felt irrevocably altered. The mundane sounds, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the squeak of cart wheels, the low murmur of distant voices, now seemed layered with a potential subtext, a hidden frequency he was only beginning to perceive. He considered reporting the scratches. But to whom? And say what? That he'd found graffiti possibly linked to the delusional writings of a patient transferred years ago, writings he'd received under bizarre circumstances? It sounded paranoid, obsessive. He could already picture the raised eyebrows, the concerned inquiries about his stress levels from colleagues like Lena Hansen. No, he needed more. Or perhaps he needed less immersion in Gilman's world. Yet the opposite happened. The scratches acted not as a deterrent, but as a catalyst. The possibility, however remote and terrifying, that Gilman's experiences were not purely subjective delusions, that some external phenomenon might have been involved, pushed Thorne deeper into the labyrinth. He spent another evening hunched over the journal, the bottle of scotch conspicuously absent this time. He needed clarity, not obfuscation. He reread the entries leading up to Gilman's admission, searching for clues, patterns, any mention of specific locations within Ashworth, beyond the general sense of the place being a convergence. March 20th. The whispers are louder. They aren't just possibilities anymore. They're instructions. Fragmentary, like tuning a radio between stations, catching snippets of a broadcast from somewhere else. It talks about resonance, about places where the seams are thin. Old places, places saturated with emotion, energy. The terms are inadequate. Ashworth keeps coming up. Not the new wings. The old sections. The foundations. March 28th followed the impulse, down to the sub-basement archives. Supposedly off-limits, but the door was unlocked. Or it opened for me. Dust everywhere. Forgotten records, decaying equipment. But the feeling down there, thick, ancient. The air hums. The angles feel sharper, more predatory. Found strange chalk marks on the floor in one of the storage vaults. Not recent. Geometric, like the symbols it shows me. Thorne's pulse quickened. The sub-basement archives. He knew the area, a maze of low-ceilinged corridors and damp storage rooms beneath the original 19th century structure, mostly used for storing obsolete equipment and decommissioned files nobody ever looked at. It was generally locked, dusty, and vaguely unsettling even without the overlay of Gilman's narrative. Had Gilman really been down there? Had he left marks? And what about Finch's consultation mentioned in the file? Finch, the historian obsessed with local legends and localized phenomena. Could there be a connection? The next afternoon, citing the need to locate an obscure older patient file for a longitudinal study, a plausible, if slightly thin, pretext, Thorne acquired the key to the sub-basement archives from a grudging custodian. The key itself was old, heavy iron, cold to the touch. Descending the narrow concrete steps, the air grew noticeably cooler, damper, carrying the smell of cold stone, mildew, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang, reminiscent of the scent he'd first associated with the journal itself. The sub-basement was as dismal as he remembered. A single low-wattage bulb cast long, dancing shadows down the main corridor, revealing doorways leading into pitch-black storage vaults. Water occasionally dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing unervingly. He moved slowly, his footsteps muffled by the layer of dust on the floor, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. He felt a prickle of unease that went beyond simple claustrophobia. It felt watchful. He checked the vaults one by one, sweeping his flashlight beam over piles of rusted bed frames, defunct electrotherapy machines shrouded in white sheets like forgotten ghosts, and stacks of ledgers bound in rotting cloth. Dust motes danced in the beam like malevolent insects. Then, in the third vault, he saw them. On the damp concrete floor, partially obscured by fallen debris, were chalk marks. Faded, clearly old, but definitely deliberate. They weren't random graffiti. They formed complex geometric patterns, angular and interlocking, radiating outwards from a central point. They were uncannily similar to the sketches in Gilman's journal, particularly the cruder ones from his time inside Ashworth. Thorne knelt, careful not to disturb them, his flashlight beam steady. The design seemed to shift slightly as he looked at it, the angles refusing to resolve into a stable, understandable pattern. It induced a faint sense of vertigo, a cognitive dissonance that mirrored the effect of Gilman's drawings. Who had made these marks? Gilman? Finch, during some arcane investigation? Or someone else entirely, long ago? The chalk looked ancient, crumbling at the edges. As he examined the central point of the largest pattern, he noticed something else. Faint scratches in the concrete itself, beneath the chalk, radiating outwards like hairline fractures. They looked like they'd been made with something incredibly sharp, and they matched the pattern of the chalk lines precisely. A sudden noise from the corridor outside the vault made him jump, heart pounding. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete. He switched off his flashlight, plunging the vault into near-total darkness, save for the weak light filtering in from the corridor bulb. He held his breath, listening. Silence. Then, a faint, almost inaudible whisper, seeming to emanate not from a specific point, but from the air itself. It wasn't words, just sibilant. Formless sounds that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He backed away from the chalk marks slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he fumbled for the heavy iron key in his pocket. Rational explanations flickered, settling sounds of the old building, air currents, his own heightened senses playing tricks. But the feeling of presence was undeniable, a cold, intelligent awareness that seemed to press in from the surrounding darkness. He retreated from the vault, pulling the heavy door closed, his gaze sweeping the corridor. Nothing, just the long shadows and the oppressive silence. He didn't lock the vault door. He moved quickly back towards the stairs, the urge to flee warring with the need to maintain some semblance of professional composure. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he glanced back down the corridor one last time. In the deep shadow beneath the single flickering bulb, did he see movement? A deepening of the darkness, a brief, unnatural contortion of the shadows? Or was it just the unreliable light playing tricks on his frayed nerves? He couldn't be sure. He turned and ascended the stairs, the heavy iron key feeling like lead in his hand. The cold dampness of the sub-basement clinging to him like a shroud. The echoes in Ashworth were growing louder, more distinct. And ere as Thorne feared, he was rapidly moving from observer to participant in Gilman's terrifying reality. Returning to the sterile familiarity of his office felt like surfacing from a deep, cold dive. Ere as Thorne locked the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment, the heavy iron key to the sub-basement feeling alien and potent in his pocket. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm counterpointing the oppressive silence of the room. The scraping sound, the sibilant whisper, the shifting shadows in the corridor. Were they real? Products of an overactive imagination fueled by Gilman's manuscript and the inherent creepiness of the asylum's underbelly? Or were they, as Gilman claimed, manifestations of the unstitched shadow? Testing the boundaries, drawn to his focused attention, he splashed cold water on his face from the small sink in the corner, staring hard at his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. His eyes looked strained, shadowed with fatigue and something else, a nascent fear he hadn't felt since, well, perhaps ever. He was a man trained to dissect fear, to categorize it, pathologize it, medicate it away, feeling it directed towards something intangible, something that defied categorization, was profoundly unsettling. He saw the logic: stress, lack of sleep, immersion in disturbing material, the power of suggestion within a known locus of psychological distress, Ashworth itself. It all added up to a predictable psychological response. Yet, the chalk marks on the floor, the scratches, both in the examination room and now confirmed beneath the chalk downstairs, felt stubbornly, materially real. He spent the next hour trying to find any official record mentioning Dr. Finch's consultation on the Gilman case or any reports documenting localized phenomena in the sub-basement. He navigated the clunky digital archives and even physically sifted through older administrative logs stored in a dusty annex off the main records room. Nothing. Finch's name appeared only in relation to his brief employment and later, bizarrely, on a few acquisition forms for historical artifacts donated to the asylum library, obscure local histories, geological surveys, treatises on architecture. There was no mention of his involvement in patient consultations beyond that single cryptic line in Gilman's file. This significant overnight event leading to Gilman's transfer was documented clinically: catatonia, vital signs stable, transfer recommended, with no reference to temperature drops, static discharge, or Finch's input. It was as if the unsettling details had been deliberately scrubbed, leaving only the bare, sanitized clinical facts. An erasure, just like Gilman's ultimate fate. Frustration gnawed at him. He felt trapped between the chilling consistency of Gilman's journal and the obstinate silence of the official record. He needed another perspective, an anchor in rationality. He needed Lena Hansen. He found her in the small staff lounge, efficiently dictating notes into her tablet between sips of lukewarm coffee. She looked up as he approached, her sharp eyes immediately registering his disquiet. "Rough day, Eris?" she asked, pausing her dictation. "You look like you wrestled a poltergeist and lost." Thorne attempted a casual shrug, leaning against the doorframe, just delving into asylum history. "You know Finch, the eccentric we talked about?" His name popped up in Walter Gilman's file just before the transfer. And he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I was down in the sub-basement archives earlier looking for related files. Found some strange old markings on the floor. Chalk geometric patterns. Almost like the kind of symbols Gilman was reportedly obsessed with." He decided against mentioning the scratches or the sounds. "Baby steps." Lena raised a skeptical eyebrow, but didn't dismiss him outright. "Sub-basement? Haven't been down there in years. Place probably hasn't been properly cleared out since the Spanish flu. Old chalk marks could be anything. Maintenance codes, remnants of some long-forgotten storage system, even patient graffiti from decades ago when security was laxer. Wouldn't read too much into it." "Eris." She took another sip of coffee. "Especially not when you're already fixated on this Gilman narrative. Confirmation bias is a bitch, even for us." I know, Thorne conceded, rubbing his temples where a headache was beginning to form. "It's just the coincidence. The patterns were specific. And finding those scratches in the old exam room the other day. Teenage vandalism? Bored patient? Faulty plaster?" Lena offered readily, ticking off possibilities on her fingers. "Eris, this place is over 100 years old and filled with people experiencing profound psychological distress. Weird things happen. Strange coincidences occur, attributing them to some eldritch influence based on one patient's detailed delusion and an eccentric historian's footnote. That's not clinical thinking. That's..." She paused, searching for the right word. "That's letting the asylum get to you." Her pragmatism was like a splash of cold water, exactly what he thought he needed. Yet, it felt inadequate against the visceral reality of the cold presence in the vault, the precision of the scratches. He thanked her, mumbling something about needing more coffee, and retreated back to his office. Lena was right, of course. Her explanations were logical, probable, but they didn't feel true. Not anymore. He felt increasingly isolated, adrift between the shores of empirical reality and the unsettling coast of Gilman's impossible world. That evening, back in the sterile quiet of his apartment, the feeling of isolation intensified. The city lights outside his window seemed colder, sharper. The familiar spaces of his living room felt subtly wrong. Was the painting on the far wall hanging slightly askew? He was sure he'd straightened it just yesterday. Hadn't he left his pen lying parallel to the edge of his notebook on the coffee table? Why was it now angled slightly towards him? Minor details. Trivial inconsistencies easily attributable to his own distraction or faulty memory. But they resonated with Gilman's descriptions of objects moving, of reality subtly fraying at the edges. He found himself checking reflections more often in the dark screen of the television, the polished surface of his toaster, the window pane mirroring the lamplit room against the night. He half expected to see the non-Euclidean distortions Gilman described, the impossible blackness staring back. He saw only his own tired, worried face. The rational part of his mind, the psychiatrist, observed these behaviors with alarm. Hypervigilance, mild paranoia, obsessive thoughts, symptomatic responses to stress and exposure to disturbing content. He needed rest. He needed distance. But another part of him, the part that had felt the chill in the sub-basement and seen the precision of the scratches, felt a different kind of alarm. A warning. He found himself drawn, inevitably, back to the journal. He opened it to the later entries, the ones written during Gilman's confinement in Ashworth, searching for anything that might explain these subtle but unnerving shifts in his own perception. April 29th. It sees through my eyes now, sometimes not controlling, not possessing. More like borrowing my optic nerve. Brief flashes. The world overlaid with faint geometric lattices. Textures resolving into impossible equations. The shadow isn't just out there anymore. It's imprinting itself. Attention is a doorway. Focus is a key. Thinking about it draws it closer. Thorn's breath hitched. Attention is a doorway. Focus is a key. Was his investigation, his obsessive reading of the journal, his exploration of the asylum's shadowed corners, inadvertently inviting the phenomenon into his own reality? Was he like Gilman, becoming attuned to its frequency? May 5th, warning. To whoever finds this, if anyone finds this, don't look too closely. Don't trace the patterns. Don't follow the lines. It feeds on comprehension. Understanding its geometry gives it purchase. It rebuilds itself in the observer's mind. Parasitic theorems. Parasitic theorems. The phrase was chillingly apartment. Was that what was happening to him? Was the unstitched shadow replicating itself within his own consciousness, subtly altering his perception of reality from the inside out? The line between psychological transference and actual metaphysical intrusion felt terrifyingly thin, perhaps even non-existent. He closed the journal abruptly, his hands clammy. He stood up, pacing the length of his apartment, feeling caged. He went to the window again, staring out at the city lights, trying to ground himself in the familiar, mundane world. Then he felt it, a distinct, unmistakable sensation. The feeling of being watched, not from the street below, not from the windows of the building opposite, but from within the room, from the corner behind his armchair, a space submerged in deep shadow. He didn't turn immediately. He stood frozen, every nerve ending screaming. There was no sound, no visual anomaly, just the absolute, icy certainty of a focused, alien intelligence observing him. It was the same feeling he'd had in the sub-basement vault, but stronger, more immediate, more personal. Slowly, deliberately, fighting the instinct to bolt, he turned his head. The corner was empty. Just shadows, cast by the familiar shapes of his furniture. But for a fleeting, sickening instant, just before he turned, hadn't the shadow in the corner seemed sharper? Less like an absence of light, and more like a presence of absolute blackness, possessing angles that didn't belong in his world? He couldn't be sure. The image vanished as soon as he focused on it, leaving only the pounding of his own heart and the lingering, bone-deep chill of being seen by something that shouldn't exist. The echoes were no longer confined to Ashworth. They had followed him home. The feeling of being watched, that distinct and chilling certainty of an alien presence sharing his apartment, did not dissipate immediately. It lingered, a palpable pressure in the air, a static cling on his psyche. As Thorne stood frozen by the window, his gaze fixed on the empty corner, every muscle tensed. He scanned the room meticulously, searching for any anomaly, any subtle distortion in the familiar interplay of light and shadow. He saw nothing overtly wrong. The furniture remained stubbornly mundane, the shadows inert, yet the feeling persisted, a cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. It was like sensing a predator nearby in dense fog. You couldn't see it, but every instinct screamed danger. He forced himself to move, crossing the room with deliberate steps, turning on every light. The harsh overhead fluorescence banished the comforting shadows, replacing them with a flat, clinical glare that felt almost as unsettling. The corner was just a corner, the intersection of two walls, empty and innocuous under the bright light. The sensation of being watched lessened slightly, retreating like a shy nocturnal creature startled by illumination, but it didn't vanish entirely. It felt withdrawn, lurking just beyond the threshold of his perception, waiting. Sleep was impossible now. The apartment, once his refuge, felt contaminated, compromised. He considered calling Lena, fabricating some urgent medical query just to hear a rational voice. But what could he say? I think Walter Gilman's geometric ghost follow me home. He'd sound like one of his own patients spiraling into psychosis. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone with this encroaching strangeness. He found himself drawn back to the journal, not for answers this time, but almost for companionship, the shared experience of terror. He flipped through the later pages, Gilman's handwriting becoming increasingly fragmented. The entries shorter, more desperate. May 11th. It's in the reflections, not just mirrors. Any polished surface. A flicker in the chrome faucet. A distortion in a spoon. A depth in a still cup of water. Sometimes, I think I see its true shape in those fleeting glimpses. All sharp angles and impossible curves, folding in on itself. Looking at it feels like cutting my brain on broken glass. May 14th. The patterns are everywhere now. In the cracks in the ceiling plaster. In the way the pipes run along the corridor walls. In the branches of the trees outside the window. Once you see the geometry, you can't unsee it. The world is a lattice of potential intrusions. It built this reality, perhaps. Or perhaps it's just dismantling it. Piece by angular piece. May 16th. Temperature drops preceded. And the static. Heard the night nurse talking about faulty wiring again. They don't understand. It draws energy. Feeds on order. Heat. Sanity. It leaves a coldness behind. A depletion. Thorne reread the last entry, thinking of the chill in the sub-basement. The reported temperature drop in Gilman's room before his transfer. He thought of the faint static he thought he'd heard. These weren't just subjective feelings. Gilman, and apparently the Ashworth Night staff, had documented potentially quantifiable physical phenomena associated with the entity's presence. Could he test this? Could he find objective proof? Something Lena Hansen couldn't dismiss as coincidence or faulty wiring. He owned a simple digital thermometer, part of a home first aid kit, driven by a desperate need for empirical data. However flimsy, he retrieved it. He walked slowly through his apartment, holding the thermometer aloft, checking the readings in different areas. The living room near the window, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The kitchen, 69 degrees Fahrenheit. The hallway, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. All perfectly normal, consistent with the thermostat setting. Then he approached the corner behind the armchair, the place where the presence had felt strongest. He held the thermometer out into the space. He watched the display. 68, 67, 66, 65. It dropped steadily, unnaturally fast. 64, 63. It stopped at 62.8 degrees Fahrenheit. A localized cold spot. Nearly 6 degrees colder than the rest of the room, with no discernible cause. No draft, no vent, no open window nearby. He pulled the thermometer back. The reading quickly climbed back to 67.9 degrees Fahrenheit. He extended his hand into the corner again. He felt it, a distinct, unnatural chill, clinging to the air like freezer burn. And with the cold, that faint but unmistakable smell returned. Ozone and something else, dry and ancient. His scientific mind scrambled for explanations. Air stratification? A quirk of the building's insulation? But the drop was too localized, too rapid. And the smell? He backed away from the corner, the thermometer clutched in his hand like a talisman. Objective data, a quantifiable anomaly. It wasn't definitive proof of a multidimensional entity, but it was something concrete that aligned precisely with Gilman's descriptions and the fragmented reports from Ashworth's past. The line between subjective experience and objective reality was blurring, and the evidence, however slight, was tipping towards the impossible. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He snapped his head towards the small, decorative mirror hanging on the opposite wall. For a fraction of a second, under the harsh fluorescent light, his reflection hadn't looked right. It seemed delayed, lagging behind his actual movement, and the space around his reflected head had it momentarily seemed darker, sharper, imbued with those wrong angles. He stared intently into the mirror. His reflection stared back, looking pale and wide-eyed, perfectly normal. No life, no distortion, nothing. Had he imagined it? A microsleep? A stress-induced perceptual glitch? Or was it what Gilman described? The entity peering through, imprinting itself onto reflective surfaces? He felt a surge of panic, a primal urge to cover the mirror, to smash it, to eliminate any surface that might offer the entity a window. He fought it down, forcing himself to remain calm, analytical. He needed to document this. He needed to think. He returned to his desk, grabbing his notepad, intending to record the temperature readings, the time, the subjective experience of the reflection. As he picked up his pen, the same pen he'd noted earlier seemed slightly askew. He saw it, etched into the smooth plastic barrel of the pen. Almost too fine to see without looking closely were three minuscule, parallel lines. Perfectly straight, perfectly precise. He dropped the pen as if it were burning hot. It clattered onto the floor. He stared at it, his breathing shallow. It hadn't been there before. He was certain. He handled that pen every day. He would have noticed. The scratches. They weren't just echoes anymore. They weren't confined to Ashworth. They were appearing here, in his apartment, on his belongings. The entity wasn't just watching. It was interacting, leaving its mark, claiming territory. The fragile boundary separating Eris Thorne's reality from Walter Gilman's nightmare hadn't just blurred. It had been breached. The echoes were becoming intrusions, and the examination room was no longer just a physical space within Ashworth. It was his own life, his own mind, and the walls were closing in. Chapter 4. The Beckoning Void. The clatter of the pen hitting the hardwood floor echoed in the unnerving silence of Eris Thorne's apartment. He stared down at it, the three minuscule, precise scratches stark against the dark plastic barrel. This was not suggestion. This was not hypervigilance or pareidolia. This was inscription, a physical mark left by an unseen agency, confirming the breach of his personal space, the violation of his presumed reality. The cold dread that had been coiling within him didn't dissipate. Instead, it crystallized into something else. A chilling, focused intensity. The time for passive observation, for skeptical rationalization, was over. Walter Gilman's journal was no longer just a record of one man's descent into madness. It was a field guide to a phenomenon that was actively intruding upon Thorne's own existence. The madman's diary had become his inheritance in a way he could never have anticipated. Not just the book itself, but the terrifying awareness it chronicled. He picked up the pen carefully, his fingers avoiding the scratches as if they might still hold a residual charge. He placed it on his desk, alongside the digital thermometer still displaying the ambient room temperature. Its earlier reading from the cold corner, a stark numerical testament to the anomaly. These were exhibits, evidence, not for Lena Hansen, not for the indifferent administrators at Ashworth, but for himself. Proof that he wasn't merely succumbing to stress or transference. Something was happening, something real, something profoundly wrong. Panic gave way to a grim determination. If this entity, this unstitched shadow, operated according to patterns, according to a kind of alien geometry as Gilman described, then perhaps it could be understood. Perhaps its intrusions could be anticipated, even counteracted. Gilman had failed, succumbing to madness or destruction, but he had left behind his notes, his observations. The journal, Thorne now realized, wasn't just a warning. It might be the only available map through the encroaching nightmare. He had to stop treating it as a symptom and start treating it as a source, however fragmented and terrifying, of vital intelligence. His focus shifted entirely. His professional obligations at Ashworth, the needs of his other patients, the collegial banter with Lena, all faded into the background, muted by the urgent, consuming priority of deciphering Gilman's legacy. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford, replaced by long hours hunched over the worn leather journal, cross-referencing entries, scrutinizing the disturbing diagrams, searching for overlooked details, recurring symbols, potential vulnerabilities. He treated Gilman's words with the obsessive attention he usually reserved for complex case histories, but now the goal wasn't diagnosis. It was survival. He began systematically cataloging the specific terminology Gilman used: unstitched shadow, wrong angles, geometric incursions, dimensional vulnerabilities, parasitic theorems, the convergence. He paid particular attention to the symbols Gilman scratched onto walls or drew frantically in the margins, the swirling non-shapes, the lattices that defied perspective, the complex sigil labeled the key found near the end, the one that seemed to incorporate both arcane and mathematical elements. If these were truly connected to the entity, perhaps they held clues to its nature or origin. His research began conventionally within the bounds of his own expertise. He revisited texts on psychosis, looking for parallels in delusional symbology, shared archetypes in the collective unconscious that might explain Gilman's specific geometric obsessions. He found superficial similarities, mandalas, complex patterns emerging in the art of schizophrenic patients, but nothing matched the specific, alien consistency of Gilman's visions, nor their apparent connection to external phenomena like temperature drops or physical markings. Psychology offered frameworks, but they felt inadequate, like trying to explain quantum physics using Newtonian mechanics. He moved outwards, cautiously at first, into the territory explored by the late Dr. Finch. He spent hours in the dusty, neglected corners of Boston's older libraries, seeking out obscure local histories, architectural treatises on the city's notoriously crooked streets and venerable buildings, including Ashworth itself, built on land with its own murky pre-colonial history, and folklore collections detailing forgotten legends of strange occurrences or disappearances in the region. He found tales of thin places, areas where the veil between worlds was supposedly weak, often associated with unusual geography or intense historical trauma. Ashworth, built over what some texts vaguely referred to as unconsecrated ground, involved in obscure colonial-era conflicts, seemed a prime candidate, but was all anecdotal, folkloric, lacking the specific, almost scientific detail that permeated Gilman's journal. His search led him online, into the deeper, less traveled currents of the internet, forums dedicated to fringe physics theories, discussions of non-Euclidean geometry in relation to consciousness, databases of arcane symbolism, communities of self-proclaimed sensitives sharing experiences that were disturbingly similar to Gilman's initial anxieties, though usually lacking his terrifying lucidity. He waded through mountains of conspiracy theories and obvious fabrications, searching for kernels of corroborating information, for any mention of symbols matching Gilman's, or phenomena echoing the unstitched shadow. He used anonymizing software, aware of the professional suicide it would represent if his colleagues ever discovered his current research trajectory. It was during one of these late-night digital excursions, deep within an archived forum discussing obscure mathematical proofs and their potential ontological implications, that he found it. A scanned page from a rare, possibly apocryphal 17th-century treatise by a renegade mathematician and mystic named Hieronymus Verbeek, who was rumored to have been institutionalized for heresy. The text, written in dense Latin interspersed with complex diagrams, discussed theoretical fractures in the perceived uniformity of space-time, conceptual knots where dimensions intersected abnormally. Verbeek theorized that such points could be loci for influence from realities operating under entirely different physical laws. And there, embedded within a complex geometric diagram illustrating one such theoretical knot, was a symbol, a small, intricate design composed of interlocking, impossible angles, radiating outwards from a central void. It was undeniably, chillingly similar to a recurring element within the larger, more frantic sigil Gilman had labeled the key. Thorne stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. Verbeek's diagram wasn't identical. It was simpler, more structured, like an academic representation compared to Gilman's desperate, terrified scrawl. But the core geometry, the specific combination of impossible angles, was the same. A symbol documented by a madman in the 21st century, mirroring a theoretical construct conceived by a supposed heretic mathematician nearly 400 years earlier. Coincidence? Shared archetypal imagery dredged from the depths of disturbed minds separated by centuries? Or was it evidence of something else? Evidence that Gilman hadn't just been delusional, but had somehow perceived or been touched by a genuine, recurring anomaly in the fabric of reality, an anomaly others had perhaps encountered, theorized about, and been driven mad by across history? He printed the scanned page, his hand shaking slightly. He placed it beside the open journal, comparing Verbeek's diagram to Gilman's frantic sigils. The connection felt undeniable, terrifying. Hieronymus Verbeek. He searched the name further, finding scant, often contradictory references. Accused of attempting to create mathematical gateways, institutionalized in Leiden. His major works supposedly destroyed. Only fragments, like the scanned page he'd found, were rumored to survive, circulating samizdat style among fringe academics and occultists. The beckoning void. The phrase, which Thorne had initially conceived as a chapter title representing Gilman's descent, now felt frighteningly literal. Gilman hadn't just stared into the abyss. He had seemingly found others who had mapped its edges, centuries before him. And now Eris Thorne, armed with a madman's journal and a fragment of heretical mathematics, felt himself being drawn inexorably towards that same precipice. The journal was no longer just a map. It was becoming an invitation, pulling him deeper into its impossible, terrifying geometry. His research had yielded its first piece of external corroboration, but instead of providing comfort or clarity, it only deepened the cosmic dread, solidifying the horrifying possibility that the unstitched shadow was not merely a figment of Gilman's imagination, but a genuine, ancient, and predatory feature of the universe. The discovery of Hieronymus Verbeek's diagram, that chilling echo of Gilman's symbols resonating across 4 centuries, fundamentally altered Eris Thorne's perception of the journal. It ceased to be solely a chronicle of psychological collapse and became, potentially, a touchstone to a hidden, terrifying stratum of reality. The unstitched shadow wasn't just Gilman's personal demon. It might be an objective, recurring phenomenon, a fracture in space-time glimpsed by others unfortunate enough, or perhaps sensitive enough to perceive it. This realization brought no comfort, only a deeper, more profound sense of dread. If the entity was real, then Gilman's fate wasn't just madness. It was potentially annihilation or absorption. And Thorne, by following Gilman's path, by focusing his attention, by seeing the patterns, was walking towards the same abyss. Yet, stepping back felt impossible. The entity had already breached his sanctuary, left its mark on his belongings, created cold spots in his apartment, flickered unervingly in his reflections. He was already involved, already marked. His only hope, he reasoned with a grim logic forged in sleepless nights and fueled by caffeine and fear, lay in understanding the phenomenon more fully. Knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, felt preferable to passive victimhood. He needed to understand the key, the convergence, the significance of Ashworth itself. His research intensified, becoming almost feverish. He cross-referenced Verbeek's fragmented theories with Gilman's descriptions of non-Euclidean space and dimensional vulnerabilities. He delved deeper into the history of Ashworth Asylum, looking beyond the official records into local archives, searching for any mention of unexplained events, patient disappearances, or architectural oddities related to the original structure, particularly the sub-basement where he'd found the chalk marks. He found whispers, old newspaper clippings mentioning periods of unusual patient mortality attributed to outbreaks of disease, but with suggestive phrasing about melancholia and wasting sicknesses, architectural notes referencing foundation repairs due to unusual settling in the oldest wing, even a bizarre, quickly suppressed report from the 1920s about staff complaining of persistent auditory and visual disturbances in the sub-basement levels, dismissed at the time as mass hysteria or poor ventilation. Nothing concrete, but threads of strangeness woven into the asylum's long history. aligning unsettlingly with the areas and phenomena Gilman described. Meanwhile, the subtle intrusions into Thorne's own life escalated. The feeling of being watched became almost constant, a low-level hum of surveillance just beneath the surface of his awareness. Objects continued to shift slightly when he wasn't looking. Books on his shelves rearranged. Papers on his desk subtly reordered overnight. He started experiencing brief moments of temporal disorientation, small skips in time, like a few seconds unaccounted for, leaving him momentarily confused about what he was doing. He'd find himself standing in a room with no memory of having walked there, or realizing he'd missed a segment of a conversation during a meeting, his mind momentarily elsewhere. The reflections became more persistent, more disturbing. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. Sometimes, glancing quickly at a darkened window or a polished surface, he would see his reflection overlaid with a faint, shimmering geometric lattice, like the patterns Gilman described. Other times, the reflection's eyes seemed wrong, too dark, too deep, holding an alien intelligence that regarded him with cold curiosity. He began avoiding mirrors, turning reflective objects towards the wall, keeping the lights on even during the day to minimize the possibility of catching those unsettling glimpses. Sleep deprivation gnawed at his rationality, blurring the lines further. Was he experiencing genuine phenomena, or were these the predictable neurological consequences of extreme stress, exhaustion, and obsessive focus on disturbing material? He clung to the memory of the thermometer reading, the physical scratches, Verbeek's diagram, anchors of objectivity in a sea of increasingly subjective horror. He knew he needed help, or at least a confidant, but who could he turn to? Lena Hansen, with her staunch biological materialism, would likely recommend immediate leave, possibly even inpatient observation. Contacting any of the online communities he'd explored felt risky, potentially drawing unwanted attention from unstable individuals, or worse, from whatever forces Verbeek and Gilman had encountered. He was trapped in a feedback loop. The phenomena drove his research, the research intensified his focus, and his focus seemed to draw the phenomena closer. One evening, reviewing Gilman's descriptions of the convergence at Ashworth, Thorne found an entry he'd previously skimmed over, dismissing it as metaphorical rambling. April 19th, Ashworth. It's tied to the place, but also to mind. A certain frequency of thought. Desperation? Fear? No, something colder. Focused intellectual curiosity directed towards the wrong subjects. Like Finch, he circled the edges, collecting stories, sensing the resonance, but he lacked the catalyst, the specific vulnerability. It needs an entry point, a mind try to map its contours. A mind like mine, or perhaps yours. The final word, yours, seemed to leap off the page, addressed directly to Thorne across the years. Gilman hadn't just been documenting. He had been anticipating a successor, someone who would follow his intellectual breadcrumbs. Focused intellectual curiosity directed towards the wrong subjects. It was a perfect description of Thorne's current obsession. He felt a chill realization. He wasn't just investigating Gilman's madness. He was potentially fulfilling a prerequisite, becoming the entry point Gilman described. The journal entry continued, detailing Gilman's attempts to understand the nature of the convergence, linking it to specific architectural points within the asylum's oldest wing, particularly the sub-basement archives and certain rooms directly above them, rooms known for structural oddities and historical cold spots. He mentioned needing specific astronomical alignments, certain atmospheric conditions, electrical storms perhaps, to amplify the effect, to thin the veil. May 8th. The storm is coming. I feel it in the air, in the static charge. The geometry sharpens. The whispers coalesce. It's showing me the final sequence. The angles to hold in the mind, the focal point in the lower vault, the resonance needed. Finch gave me books, old texts. Verbeek, others. He thought they were just history. He didn't see the connections. Didn't understand the application. Tonight, maybe tonight, the doorway opens. This entry, Written just days before Gilman's significant overnight event and subsequent disappearance, felt like a blueprint. A blueprint for what? For summoning the entity? Communicating with it? Or simply for achieving the final, irreversible unraveling Gilman feared? It mentioned Finch providing books, Verbeek among them. So Finch hadn't just been consulted after the fact. He had actively, perhaps unwittingly, supplied Gilman with the very materials that fueled his obsession and potentially precipitated his final crisis. A storm. Thorne glanced out his apartment window. The sky over Boston was darkening, heavy clouds rolling in from the coast. The weather forecast had predicted severe thunderstorms for the next 24 hours. A coincidence? Or was the environment itself beginning to align with the conditions described in the journal, drawn by his own intensifying focus? He felt a pull, a morbid curiosity mixed with self-preservation. Gilman had mentioned a specific focal point in the lower vault, the one with the chalk marks. He described needing to hold certain angles in the mind, implying a mental component, a specific state of focused awareness combined with the location and atmospheric conditions. Was Gilman planning a ritual? An experiment? The beckoning void wasn't just a passive abyss. It seemed to actively lure those who studied it, promising knowledge while threatening dissolution. Thorne felt the pull strongly now, the urge to go back to Ashworth, back to the sub-basement during the approaching storm, to see if the phenomena intensified, to understand what Gilman had been attempting. It was a reckless, potentially suicidal impulse, born of desperation and a terrifying, burgeoning curiosity about the true nature of the unstitched shadow. The Madman's diary had provided the map. Now, the void itself seemed to be calling him towards the final, terrifying destination. The rumble of distant thunder vibrated through the floorboards of Eris Thorne's apartment, a low growl that seemed to answer the frantic pulse beating in his own chest. The predicted storm wasn't just approaching. It was announcing itself, mirroring the tempest gathering within him. Gilman's words resonated with the atmospheric tension. The storm is coming. I feel it in the air, in the static charge. The geometry sharpens. Thorne could almost feel it himself, a prickling energy, a heightened sense of awareness that bordered on painful. The air in the apartment felt thick, charged, the silence between thunderclaps heavy with anticipation. The impulse to return to Ashworth, to the sub-basement vault during the storm's peak, solidified from a reckless thought into a terrifying imperative. It felt less like a conscious decision and more like succumbing to an inexorable current. Was it his own morbid curiosity, a desperate gamble for understanding? Or was it the entity itself, the unstitched shadow, manipulating his thoughts, drawing him towards the convergence, like a moth to a corrupted flame? He couldn't be sure, and the ambiguity was part of the horror. He paced the apartment, the journal open on his desk, Verbeek's diagram lying beside it. He reread Gilman's final, frantic entries, searching for any detail he might have missed, any clue about what Gilman actually intended to do. Was it an attempt to banish the entity? To communicate? To somehow harness its power? Or simply an act of final, desperate surrender? The text remained maddeningly ambiguous, hinting at a process involving mental focus, specific angles, and the physical locus of the vault, amplified by the storm's energy. It needs the mind to hold the shape. One fragmented line read, "The observer becomes the lens." Another mentioned resonance, the need to tune oneself to the frequency of the fracture. It sounded terrifyingly like instructions for self-immolation on a psychic level. He looked at his reflection in the dark window pane, lightning momentarily illuminating his pale, drawn face. The disturbing lag, the flicker of wrongness in the eyes. It seemed more pronounced now, as if the approaching storm was thinning the veil not just at Ashworth, but here, within his own space. Reflected in his own image, the feeling of being watched intensified, no longer just a background hum, but a focused, almost palpable pressure. Rationality screamed at him to stop, to call Lena, confess everything, accept the diagnosis of stress-induced psychosis, take medical leave, get as far away from Ashworth and the journal as possible. He even picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Lena's contact. What would he say? Lena, I think a trans-dimensional entity described by a dead patient and a 17th century heretic is manifesting in my apartment and wants me to meet it in the asylum basement during the thunderstorm. The call wouldn't achieve anything but confirming his colleague's worst fears about his mental state. He was too far down the rabbit hole now. He had to see it through. He had to know. With grim resolve, he began to prepare. He changed out his work clothes into darker, more practical attire. He found a sturdy flashlight with fresh batteries, checking its beam against the increasingly gloomy room. He carefully folded the printout of Verbeek's diagram and tucked it into his pocket. And the journal? Should he take it? It felt both like essential equipment and dangerous contagion. Leaving it felt like abandoning his only guide. Taking it felt like carrying the source of the infection directly into the heart of the phenomenon. He hesitated, then zipped the worn leather book into an inner pocket of his jacket. He couldn't face this without it. As he gathered his keys, another rumble of thunder shook the building, closer this time. Rain began to lash against the windows, driven by a rising wind. The lights flickered momentarily. Static charge. Geometry sharpens. He made one last concession to self-preservation, or perhaps just a procedure. He scribbled a quick note on his desk pad, dating and timing it, heading to Ashworth. Subbasement archive. Investigating Gilman case, anomalies linked to storm activity. If not back by morning, check Vault 3. He hesitated, then added. Inform Dr. Hansen. It felt inadequate, absurdly clinical given the circumstances, but it was something. A potential breadcrumb, should the worst happen. Leaving the apartment felt like crossing a threshold. The wind tore at him as he reached the street, the rain already plastering his hair to his scalp. The city lights seemed distorted through the downpour, haloed and strange. Driving towards Ashworth felt surreal, the familiar route transformed by the storm's fury and his own heightened senses. Street lights seemed to flicker in time with the lightning, casting strobing shadows that danced with impossible angles. He gripped the steering wheel, focusing on the road, trying to ignore the way the rain on the windshield sometimes seemed to form complex, fleeting geometric patterns before being swept away by the wipers. He felt hyper-aware, his senses overloaded, yet simultaneously detached, as if watching himself perform these actions from a distance. He reached the imposing gates of Ashworth Asylum just as the storm broke in full force. Lightning cracked directly overhead, illuminating the dark, rain-lashed edifice in a stark, Gothic silhouette. Thunder exploded simultaneously, the sound deafening, visceral. The building looked less like a hospital and more like a monstrous, brooding presence waiting for him. The main entrance would be locked to visitors at this hour, the staff trance-monitored. He needed another way in, a less conspicuous route. He drove around to the older, less maintained service road that ran along the back of the original wing, towards the area above the subbasement. He parked the car under the dubious shelter of some ancient, groaning trees, switching off the engine. The only sounds were the roar of the wind, the relentless drumming of rain on the roof, and the pounding of his own heart. He sat for a moment in the darkness, the flashlight heavy in his hand, the journal pressing against his ribs. This was it, the convergence, the time, the place, the state of mind, all aligning under the electric fury of the storm. The void was beckoning, and Eris Thorne, psychiatrist turned unwilling explorer of forbidden geometries, was about to answer its call. He opened the car door, stepping out into the raging storm, and began walking towards the shadowed service entrance of Ashworth's oldest, darkest heart. The service entrance door, predictably, was locked, a heavy, rusted metal affair set deep into the damp stone foundation. Thorne hadn't expected otherwise. He played his flashlight beam along the edges, searching for any weakness, any sign of forced entry that might suggest Gilman had come this way. Nothing. But as the beam swept upwards, towards the small, grime-encrusted window set high in the wall above the door. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the interior. Through the distorted glass, Thorn thought he saw movement, a flickering, perhaps, or just a reflection of the storm outside. He needed another way. Recalling the layout from old architectural plans he'd studied, plans Finch might have also shown Gilman. He knew there were ventilation grates leading into the sub-basement system further along the foundation wall, partially hidden by overgrown, neglected shrubbery. They were meant for air circulation, not access, but they were a possibility. Fighting his way through the whipping, rain-soaked branches, Thorn found one of the grates. It was heavy cast iron, bolted securely to the stone. He pushed against it, testing its strength. Immovable. He tried another, further down. This one felt slightly looser, rattling faintly when he applied pressure. He knelt, shielding his flashlight from the worst of the rain, examining the bolts. They were old, rusted, the heads partially stripped. Someone had tampered with this before. Gilman? Finch? He didn't have tools, but desperation fueled ingenuity. He found a loose piece of slate nearby, its edge sharp enough to potentially work into the gap between the grate and the stone. Using it as a makeshift lever, bracing himself against the muddy ground, he put all his weight into it. The rusted metal groaned in protest. He strained, muscles screaming, the rain stinging his eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp, grating screech that was swallowed by the next clap of thunder, one of the lower bolts gave way, snapping clean off. Encouraged, he worked on the other side. It took precious minutes. His hands scraped raw, his clothes soaked through and caked with mud, but finally, the second lower bolt sheared off. The heavy grate sagged downwards, held only by the upper fastenings. He could just barely squeeze through the opening created at the bottom. He hesitated for only a second. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about confined spaces, structural integrity. The sheer insanity of crawling into the bowels of an asylum during a hurricane-level storm to investigate a potentially imaginary entity. But the pull towards the convergence, towards answers, towards the terrifying heart of the mystery, was stronger. He pushed the flashlight ahead of him, took a deep breath that tasted of wet earth and ozone, and wriggled through the narrow opening, scraping his jacket against the rough stone. He dropped perhaps 3 feet onto a debris-strewn floor inside a narrow ventilation tunnel. The air immediately changed, colder, stagnant, thick with the smell of damp concrete, mildew, and that persistent, underlying metallic tang. The roar of the storm was muffled now, replaced by the dripping of water, the low hum of unseen machinery somewhere deeper in the building, and the unsettling echo of his own breathing. He retrieved the grate, managing to wedge it back into a semblance of its original position from the inside, not secure, but perhaps less obviously disturbed. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting a swathe through the oppressive darkness. The tunnel was low, forcing him to stoop, and coated in decades of grime. Pipes snaked along the walls, slick with condensation. He consulted his memory of the plans, orienting himself. He needed to head deeper, towards the central core of the old wing, towards the area designated as archives, towards Vault 3. Moving through the cramped, dark tunnels felt like navigating the passages of a forgotten tomb. The silence, broken only by the storm's distant fury and the building's internal groans, pressed in on him. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger here, more pervasive, as if the very structure around him held a malevolent awareness. Shadows cast by the flashlight beam seemed to writhe at the edges of his vision, coalescing into impossible angles before dissolving back into mundane shapes. He thought he heard faint whispering again, sibilant and directionless, weaving through the ambient sounds. Was it the wind in the vents? Rats skittering in the walls? Or the entity, sensing his proximity, welcoming him deeper into its domain? He passed junctions, checked crumbling labels on pipes, trying to match them to the layout etched in his mind. He found himself relying less on conscious memory and more on a strange, intuitive sense of direction, a pull towards a specific point deeper within the maze. Was this his own subconscious guiding him, or was it the influence Gilman described, the entity showing him the way? Finally, he reached a larger junction. Recognizing the configuration from his previous visit, he was close to the archive corridor. He could hear a faint, rhythmic humming sound now, seemingly emanating from further down the passage leading towards the vaults. It wasn't the steady hum of machinery. It was lower, more resonant, fluctuating slightly in pitch, almost like a distorted chant just below the threshold of intelligibility. The air here felt significantly colder, the metallic tang stronger, mixed with the distinct smell of ozone, like the aftermath of an electrical discharge. He gripped the flashlight tighter, his knuckles white. He took the final turn into the archive corridor. The single, low-wattage bulb he remembered was dark now, perhaps shaken loose by the storm, or perhaps deliberately extinguished. The only light was his own beam, carving a path through the absolute darkness. The humming intensified, vibrating not just in the air, but in the floor beneath his feet, in the fillings in his teeth. He reached the door to Vault 3, the one where he'd found the chalk marks. It stood slightly ajar, darkness pooling within. The humming seemed to emanate directly from inside. He pushed the heavy door open further, its hinges groaning in protest. The sight that greeted him made him freeze, his breath catching in his throat. The vault wasn't empty. The flashlight beam swept across the familiar chalk patterns on the floor, but now they seemed brighter, pulsating faintly with a pale, internal light that shifted and writhed, the impossible angles seeming to actively fold and unfold. The air crackled with palpable static electricity, raising the hairs on his skin. The cold was intense, biting, and in the center of the largest chalk pattern, where the lines converged, the darkness seemed concentrated. It wasn't just shadow. It was a patch of absolute void, a hole punched through reality, absorbing the flashlight beam, seeming to drink the light. It swirled slowly, a vortex of utter blackness, and from its depths emanated the low, resonant hum that vibrated through the room. Thorne stared, mesmerized and terrified. This was it, the convergence. Amplified by the storm, activated by what? His presence? Gilman's lingering psychic residue? Some cyclical alignment? As he watched, the edges of the void seemed to sharpen, angles coalescing within the blackness. Angles that were fundamentally wrong, violating Euclidean space, hinting at higher, incomprehensible dimensions. It was exactly as Gilman had described. A presence defined by absence, a shape suggested by the way reality bent around it. The unstitched shadow. It wasn't inert. It sensed him. He felt its attention lock onto him, a cold, analytical regard devoid of any emotion he could recognize. The humming intensified, shifting pitch, forming into something that scraped against his auditory nerves, almost like words, but in a language composed of geometric concepts and grating static. Observer, lens, aperture. The concepts flooded his mind, bypassing his ears, imprinted directly onto his consciousness. It wasn't communication, it was definition. It was identifying his function. He instinctively reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the folded printout of Verbeek's diagram, the other hand clutching the journal inside his jacket. Was this the moment? Was he supposed to hold the angles in his mind as Gilman wrote? To try and understand? To map? To focus? The beckoning void pulsed before him, a gateway to terrifying knowledge and potential annihilation. Gilman had stood here, perhaps on a night just like this, facing this same impossible reality. Had he opened the door? And what had come through? Or had he simply been consumed? As Thorne stood at the precipice, the storm raging outside, the entity swirling before him. The madman's journal a heavy weight against his chest. The choice was his. Observe? Engage? Flee? But fleeing felt impossible now. He had come too far. The void was open, and it was waiting for him to look inside. Chapter 5, Beyond the Final Page. Observer, lens, aperture. The concepts hammered into Eris Thorne's mind, cold, sharp, and utterly alien. It wasn't a voice, not language as humans knew it, but pure, raw meaning impressed upon his consciousness, a definition of his role in this horrifying equation. He stood frozen before the swirling vortex of absolute blackness in the center of the pulsating chalk marks, the flashlight beam swallowed by its impossible depths. The unstitched shadow wasn't merely present. It was assessing him, recognizing his focused attention as the final component needed for whatever process this convergence enabled. He was the focal point, the biological lens through which its influence could be fully projected or received. Terror warred with a sudden, perverse surge of clinical fascination. He was witnessing something that shattered every paradigm he knew, a genuine glimpse beyond the veil of perceived reality. The scientist in him, however battered, craved understanding. What was this entity? What were its goals? What knowledge lay within that swirling void? Gilman had perhaps given in to this curiosity, becoming the lens, trying to map the contours, and paid the price. Verbeek, centuries earlier, had theorized, perhaps even experimented, and been branded a heretic driven mad. Thorne clutched the folded printout of Verbeek's diagram in his pocket, its angular lines feeling sharp even through the fabric. He felt the weight of Gilman's journal against his ribs. He had followed the path, deciphered the clues, arrived at the designated time and place. The beckoning void was open, inviting him to fulfill his perceived function. But as the entity's non-auditory humming intensified, weaving complex, nauseating geometries through his thoughts, a core of resistance flared within him. He wasn't Gilman. He wasn't Verbeek. He was Eris Thorne, psychiatrist, trained to analyze and contain madness, not embrace it. He wouldn't be the lens. He wouldn't be the aperture for this thing to gain further purchase in his reality. If attention was a doorway, and focus was a key, perhaps misdirection, perhaps introducing chaos into the precise geometry the entity seemed to rely on, was a defense. He recalled Gilman's frantic words. Understanding its geometry gives it purchase. It rebuilds itself in the observer's mind. What if he refused to understand? What if he actively held contradictory concepts in his mind? With a surge of desperate adrenaline, Thorne forced his gaze away from the hypnotic swirling of his central void, focusing instead on the intricate, pulsating chalk patterns on the floor. He wouldn't try to comprehend their impossible angles. Instead, he deliberately recalled the simplest, most fundamental Euclidean shapes: a perfect circle, a square, an equilateral triangle. He visualized them with intense concentration, overlaying their mundane stability onto the writhing, alien geometry at his feet. He mentally recited basic geometric axioms, the bedrock principles of the reality the unstitched shadow sought to unravel. A straight line segment can be extended indefinitely. A circle can be drawn with any center and radius. All right angles are congruent. The reaction was immediate and violent. The low humming spiked into a discordant shriek that scraped directly against his neurons, bypassing his ears entirely, causing searing pain behind his eyes. The pale light emanating from the chalk marks flared erratically, sputtering like a dying star. The temperature in the vault plunged further, stealing the breath from his lungs. Frost instantly blooming on the stone walls. The central void seemed to boil, blackness churning, and tendrils of distorted space, like heat haze made solid and sharp, lashed out from its edges. Incorrect. Aberration. Noise. The concept slammed into his mind, no longer analytical, but filled with something akin to rage, or perhaps just system error. Thorne staggered back, shielding his eyes from the flaring light, the psychic assault threatening to overwhelm him. He fumbled inside his jacket, pulling out Gilman's journal. Not to read it, but to use it. This book, this repository of the entity's influence, this record of its patterns. What if disrupting its physical form could disrupt the connection? He ripped a handful of pages from the binding, pages filled with Gilman's tortured script and impossible diagrams. With a defiant yell that was swallowed by the psychic din, he threw them towards the swirling void. The pages didn't simply fall or burn. As they neared the vortex, they seemed to stretch, distort, the ink bleeding into strange, smeared patterns before being utterly annihilated, disintegrating into nothingness without ash or smoke. But the act seemed to further destabilize the phenomenon. The shrieking intensified, reaching an unbearable crescendo. Loose debris, pebbles, dust, fragments of rusted metal, lifted from the floor, swirling around the room in a miniature cyclone centered on the void. The very structure of the vault seemed to groan, hairline cracks appearing in the ceiling plaster above the vortex. He remembered the iron key to the sub-basement still heavy in his pocket. Iron, a traditional element in folklore, often used in wards against malevolent entities. Probably meaningless superstition, but in this reality-bending crucible, he'd grasp at anything. He pulled it out, its cold weight a solid anchor. He focused again, not on simple shapes this time, but on the clinical diagnoses from Gilman's file, reciting them mentally with all the force of his professional certainty. Schizoaffective disorder, paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, geometric preoccupation secondary to psychosis. He imbued the words with dismissal, with the power of rational explanation, using his psychiatric knowledge as a weapon against the very phenomenon it sought to deny. He hurled the heavy iron key directly towards the churning blackness. Unlike the pages, the key didn't annihilate immediately. It struck the edge of the void with a sound like a struck gong, emitting a shower of brilliant white sparks. For a split second, the impossible geometry within the vortex flickered, seemed to lose cohesion, interrupted by the mundane, solid reality of the iron. And then the unstitched shadow screamed. It wasn't a sound, but a wave of pure, unadulterated psychic agony and fury that slammed into Thorn, buckling his knees, sending him crashing backwards against the cold stone wall. The light from the chalk marks exploded in a final, blinding flash, then extinguished completely. The vortex imploded violently, collapsing in on itself with a deafening implosion that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Darkness, silence, an agonizing pain lancing through Thorn's head. How long ere as Thorn lay slumped against the cold, damp stone wall of Vault 3, he couldn't say. Seconds bled into minutes in the absolute darkness that followed the implosion. His head throbbed with a pain so intense it felt structural, as if the psychic shriek had fractured something deep within his skull. His ears rang, not with sound, but with the phantom echo of that final, agonizing mental assault. The air, thick and still, tasted metallic, heavy like blood and ozone. The biting cold had lessened slightly. The oppressive static charge dissipated, leaving behind only the natural chill of the sub-basement. Slowly, painstakingly, he pushed himself upright, his limbs trembling, his muscles aching as if he'd been physically beaten. He fumbled for the flashlight he dropped, his fingers brushing against loose debris on the floor, grit, fragments of plaster, and something else, small, brittle pieces that felt disturbingly like the torn pages of Gilman's journal, now inert, lacking their previous strange energy. His fingers closed around the flashlight's cool metal casing. He thumbed the switch. Nothing. The bulb remained dark. The implosion, or the psychic backlash, must have fried its circuitry or shattered the filament. He was plunged back into absolute blackness, the disorientation threatening to overwhelm him. Panic fluttered briefly in his chest, trapped, blind in the bowels of Ashworth. He fought it down, forcing himself to breathe slowly, evenly. He wasn't completely blind. He remembered the layout. He knew the way out, theoretically. He staggered towards the vault doorway, his hands outstretched, shuffling his feet to avoid tripping over unseen obstacles. Reaching the corridor felt like a minor victory. The darkness out here was marginally less absolute, perhaps a faint ambient light filtering down from ventilation shaft far above, or maybe just his eyes adjusting, creating phantom luminescence. The resonant humming that had filled the space before was gone. The silence felt profound, empty, almost unnatural after the preceding sensory overload. The oppressive feeling of being watched. That focused, intelligent presence had also vanished. The air felt neutral, depleted. He turned, peering back into the impenetrable blackness of Vault 3. Had he done it? Had he actually disrupted the convergence, driven the unstitched shadow back into whatever impossible dimension it inhabited? Had throwing Gilman's words and Finch's key into its heart somehow short-circuited its connection to this place, this reality? Or had he merely angered it, forced it into a temporary retreat? The lack of certainty was almost as terrifying as the confrontation itself. He needed to get out. Staying here felt profoundly wrong, like lingering at the scene of a horrific accident. He began the slow, arduous journey back through the ventilation tunnels, navigating by touch and memory, his steps hesitant in the near-total darkness. Every scrape of his shoe, every distant drip of water, echoed unervingly, magnified by the silence and his own frayed nerves. The tunnels themselves felt different now, just old, damp, dirty passages, stripped of the malevolent awareness that had seemed to permeate them on his way in. Or perhaps he was simply too numb, too psychically battered to perceive it anymore. He eventually reached the junction near the access grate. He could hear the storm outside more clearly here, though it sounded less ferocious than before, the wind easing, the rain falling less violently. Hope flickered, a chance to escape back into the mundane world, the world of weather patterns and solid ground. Pushing against the loosened grate, he managed to swing it outwards enough to squeeze through the opening. He emerged back into the night, gasping the cool, rain-washed air. The worst of the storm had indeed passed. Dark clouds still scudded across the sky, but patches of faint pre-dawn light were visible on the eastern horizon. The rain had subsided to a steady drizzle. He stood there for a moment, leaning against the cold, wet stone wall of Ashworth, mud-caked, soaked, shivering, his head pounding, utterly exhausted but undeniably alive. He looked back at the asylum, its dark bulk looming against the lightening sky. It looked inert again, just an old building filled with human sorrow, its temporary window into cosmic horror seemingly closed. He stumbled back toward his car, hidden beneath the dripping trees. Getting inside, sinking into the driver's seat, felt like reaching a sanctuary, however temporary. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was pale, streaked with grime, his eyes bloodshot and haunted, but they were his eyes. The subtle wrongness, the reflection lag, the alien intelligence, it was gone. He checked his pen, still in his pocket. The minuscule scratches were still there, a physical reminder, a scar left on his reality. He touched the inner pocket where the journal had been. He could feel the remaining bulk of the book, but also the ragged edges where he'd torn pages out. Damaged, violated, like himself. He started the car, the familiar rumble of the engine a profoundly comforting sound. He drove slowly away from Ashworth Asylum, the tires crunching on the wet gravel of the service road. He didn't look back immediately, focusing on navigating away from the oppressive shadow of the institution. Only when he reached the main road did he allow himself a glance in the rearview mirror. Ashworth stood silhouetted against the gray dawn, silent and imposing. Had he truly closed the door Gilman and Verbeek had opened? Or had he merely slammed it shut, leaving the lock damaged? The entity waiting patiently on the other side for the next storm, the next susceptible mind, the next observer? The final pages of Gilman's journal were gone, consumed by the void. The key was lost within the vault's darkness. Thorne was left with the remaining, fragmented text, the chilling corroboration of Verbeek's diagram, the physical scratches on his pen, and the indelible trauma etched into his mind. He had survived the convergence, faced the beckoning void, and somehow turned back, but the victory felt hollow, incomplete. He hadn't destroyed the unstitched shadow. He had, perhaps, only confirmed its existence and demonstrated a potential vulnerability. What now? Could he return to his life, his practice? Could he sit across from patients discussing their anxieties and delusions, knowing what he now knew or suspected about the true fragility of reality. The potential for genuine incursions from beyond? Could he ever truly feel safe, knowing that attention could be a doorway, that the wrong kind of curiosity could invite horrors beyond comprehension? The journal offered no more answers. Its final pages were unwritten, left for him to navigate alone. He drove towards the rising sun, away from the darkness of Ashworth, but carrying a piece of that darkness within him. The immediate confrontation was over, but the haunting knowledge remained. The madman's diary had yielded its terrible secrets, but the story felt far from finished. The void had been glimpsed, its presence confirmed, and the universe suddenly felt infinitely larger, colder, and more terrifyingly complex than Eris Thorne had ever dared to imagine. He had looked beyond the final page of Gilman's narrative, and the blank space stretching before him was filled with uncertainty and a lingering, existential dread. The drive back to his apartment was a blur. Eris Thorne navigated the awakening city streets on autopilot, the gray dawnlight filtering through the rain-streaked windshield, feeling both blessedly mundane and jarringly unreal. Every normal sight, commuters heading to work, traffic lights changing, shops opening, seemed overlaid with the phantom geometry he'd witnessed. The memory of the swirling void, a persistent afterimage behind his eyelids. He felt disconnected, an unwilling visitor returned from a hostile dimension, struggling to reintegrate into a world that now seemed impossibly fragile, its familiar laws merely suggestions, easily broken. Back within the sterile confines of his apartment, the silence was profound. The feeling of being watched was gone, the oppressive atmospheric charge dissipated. The localized cold spot in the corner behind the armchair registered a normal temperature. The scratches on his pen remained, stark and real, but no new marks appeared. It seemed the immediate connection, the resonance established through his focused attention and amplified by the storm, had indeed been severed by the violent confrontation in the vault. He had closed the aperture, at least for now. He stripped off his mud-caked, rain-soaked clothes, leaving them in a pile by the door like discarded remnants of another life. A long, scalding shower washed away the physical grime, but did little to cleanse the internal residue of the experience. He examined himself in the steamed-up bathroom mirror, the haunted eyes. The exhaustion lines etched deeper than ever, a small cut on his hand from scrambling through the grate. But no sign of the reflection lag, no hint of alien intelligence staring back. He was himself, horrifyingly, irrevocably altered, but still himself. He spent the next few days in a state of suspended animation. He called Ashworth, leaving a terse message for Lena Hansen, citing sudden illness, exhaustion, severe migraine, necessitating immediate sick leave. He knew it was a flimsy excuse, especially after his earlier agitated state and his stated intention to visit the archives, but he couldn't face her questions, her skepticism, her inevitable concern that would likely lead to professional intervention. He needed time to process, time to heal, time to decide how to live with the knowledge he now possessed. He didn't sleep much. When he did drift off, his dreams were haunted by impossible angles, swirling blackness, and the crushing weight of Gilman's despair mingled with Verbeek's dangerous curiosity. He'd wake with his heart pounding, the psychic shriek of the entity echoing in his mind. During waking hours, he mostly sat, staring out the window, the remaining pages of Gilman's journal lying closed on the table beside Verbeek's diagram. He couldn't bring himself to open the journal again yet, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it either. It was a testament, a warning, perhaps even still a weapon, should the need arise again. The scratches on his pen served as a constant, tactile reminder that what he experienced wasn't a dream or a delusion. His worldview had been irrevocably fractured. The comfortable assumptions of empirical science, the neat categorizations of psychology, they felt woefully inadequate to encompass the reality he had glimpsed. He understood now the fine line Gilman had walked, the terrifying allure of trying to map the unmappable. He felt a chilling empathy for the man whose madness he had initially dismissed. Gilman hadn't just been sick, he had been exposed. Exposed to a truth so alien and corrosive it shattered the human mind. Could he return to psychiatry? Could he listen to patients describe their inner demons without wondering if some of those demons were more than mere metaphors? Could he prescribe medications intended to correct chemical imbalances, knowing that some imbalances might be the result of exposure to frequencies or geometries the human brain was never meant to perceive? The very foundations of his profession felt shaken. He might go back to Ashworth eventually, out of necessity, out of habit, but he would never again see its walls, its patients, or the shadows in its corners the same way. He would forever be listening for the faint hum, watching for the angles that didn't quite align, feeling for the unnatural drop in temperature. He was marked, not just by the entity, but by the awareness itself. He never retrieved the heavy iron key from the darkness of Vault 3. He never filed a report about the damaged ventilation grate or the events in the sub-basement. To do so would invite questions he couldn't answer, leading down a path that could end with his own confinement within Ashworth's walls. The note he'd left on his desk remained there, unread by anyone else, a solitary testament to his harrowing journey. He survived. He closed the door for now, but the experience left him fundamentally changed, haunted by the knowledge that reality was layered, complex, and potentially hostile in ways humanity scarcely imagined. The unstitched shadow, or others like it, might still be out there, lurking in the frayed seams of existence, waiting for the right conditions, the right observer, the right lens. He picked up the damaged journal, its cover feeling strangely inert now, like shed skin. He ran his fingers over the torn edges where pages were missing, sacrificed to the void. Perhaps Gilman's true legacy wasn't just the warning, but the demonstration that even faced with cosmic horror beyond comprehension, defiance was possible. Resistance, however costly, could make a difference. It was a sliver of hope in an ocean of existential dread. The final page of the journal might be gone, but Eris Thorne's story continued, forever shadowed by the beckoning void he had faced and, somehow, turned away from. The scratches on his pen would fade with time and use, but the scars on his psyche, the knowledge of the terrifying geometries that underpin reality, would remain. The silence from the void felt less like peace and more like a pause, a held breath in the vast, dark library of the cosmos. Dr. Thorne survived his encounter in the depths of Ashworth, but the echoes of the madman's diary and the entity it described linger. What truly happened to Walter Gilman? Was the unstitched shadow banished or merely waiting? Some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. Thank you for joining me, Eli Nightfall, on this descent into the madman's diary. If this journey into psychological and cosmic horror resonated with you, if you felt the chill of the void and the weight of forbidden knowledge, please let me know in the comments below. Your thoughts, your theories, your own experiences with the uncanny, they fuel this channel. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the tale, and subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel for more weekly audiobook narrations of original horror novellas and stories designed to keep you awake long after the lights go out. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey into the shadows. Your support allows me to keep crafting these nightmares for you. Until next time, sleep well if you can.